today? Everyone must be sleeping, perhaps. Everyone's just taking a nap. Well, I hope those of you who are here are feeling excited to talk about events. So we're going to move on from just manipulating the DOM to actually being able to manipulate the DOM based on user interactions. So that'll be a nice change for today. But hey, real quick, what are some things that you all remember from our lesson on Tuesday? What are some methods or concepts that you all remember from our last lesson? Go ahead and share in our live chat. Let's just refresh our brains. It's been a couple days. What are some things that you all remember from our previous lesson? What do y'all think? What are some things you all remember from our previous lesson? Excellent, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so we could learn how to create elements, how to append elements. Excellent. So two methods that we talked about. What were those methods attached to? How do we call create element? How do we call append? What do you all think? All right, there we go. Some people are typing. Yeah, so what are some of the other things we learned last time on Tuesday? I mean, y'all, they might be rough. This might be a bumpy ride. If I'll remember as create element and append. Yeah, so Joseph points out we can call append on whatever the parent element is for sure. We also have that document keyword, right, that gives us access to something we talked about. Document gives us access to some kind of thing for sure. We talked about removing elements. We talked about some of the different attributes we could use to update elements as well, right? There are a couple different ways to update style as well in terms of the style property. We also had a method that could do that as well. All right, folks feeling shy, I suppose. Okay, well, let me go and share my screen. Excellent, thanks, Omar. Query selector all. Yeah, exactly, right? Those are ways for us to access individual elements based on the CSS selector. Cool. All right, well, if Tuesday is feeling far away, today might be a bit of a challenge. I'm going to really push you all. If you have questions about how something's working, you have a couple options. One is to suffer in silence. That's an option. You could do that. I recommend against it. Instead, maybe use this time to ask questions of like, hey, remind me what this method does, or I don't understand this bit about the callbacks, right? I know sometimes it can feel like it's nice to just watch the videos, so you can just watch it again. While watching things, unfortunately, is not learning. So in terms of actually being able to learn the content we have, it's going to be really important to engage with it. So if y'all have questions, please do let me know. Today, we're going to forge ahead, and whereas on Tuesday, we discussed different ways to manipulate and access the DOM, right? That was our document object model, our virtual representation of HTML and CSS. Today, we're going to be talking about how to, based on user input, be able to interact with the DOM in some way. So our plan for today in this lesson, we're going to dive into event handling in JavaScript, which is essential for creating interactive web pages. We're going to learn how to respond to user actions like clicks, keyboard inputs, and mouse movements. We're hoping by the end of the lesson, you're going to be able to attach event listeners to DOM elements, handle different types of events using JavaScript, and implement interactive functionalities based on user interactions. That's the end goal for today. All right, so let's kick it off. So we've talked about DOM and its manipulation. So the next step is talking about events. So writing code that responds to browser and user interactions is often known as event-driven programming. We'll often just talk about it as events. Event handling is another common term for it. And as you can see in this image, there are a whole bunch of different kind of actions that are happening of someone clicking on something, someone liking things, someone logging in. Based on these different actions, we might want to perform some sort of action to the user to show something, to hide something, things like that. So an event refers to an action triggered by the user or the browser, such as clicking, hovering, pressing a button, any of our web pages, particularly nowadays that we look at, as opposed to it being a flyer, right, for your business, for some more informational. Often now they are interactive in a way. So any kind of interaction you can do with a website is often going to be an event. So some examples are clicking, hovering, selecting an element with the cursor, pressing a key on the keyboard, resizing or closing the browser window, completing the loading of the web page, submitting a form, playing, pausing, or ending a video, or even encountering an error. Sometimes that can be an event as well. All right, so quick pause. Which of the following do you all think is not a DOM event? It's a little bit of just a guess. What do you all think? Just take a guess. Be brave. Thanks, Omar. Perhaps network changes. Perhaps switching tabs. Yeah, excellent. Any other thoughts? Yeah, these are all pretty, I would say, pretty odd events. Mouse wheel scrolling feels like, well, perhaps we can account for that. But the rest of these feel a little maybe outside of the browser, a little unique. In this case, whoever is writing this was just having a good time. And in this case, all of these options are actually DOM events. These are all things that you can trigger some kind of action on. So copying and pasting text, you all might have seen this. I think actually it might be in Codio. We'll see if we can find an example later when you click sort of that copy button or start to copy and paste things. Sometimes a little message might pop up that says, this has been copied, your code's been copied, right? That's something you can actually trigger. Switching tabs, you all might have noticed this if you ever had to watch like a onboarding video and it's something like really boring and has like weird little animations. You're like, I'm just gonna go check like, Twitter for a second. And if you switch tabs, it stops playing, right? So you can run different events by switching tabs. Network changes, you all might have seen this, perhaps even on Codio. I think I've seen something like this on Codio, but other websites as well. If your network is slowing down, something might show up that says like, hey, you're having network instability or something like that. And mouse wheel scrolling as well as a way to perhaps interact with the web page overall. So all these things can be tracked, and there's some names down here for what those events are named in JavaScript. So in this lesson, we're not going to cover every single event. Ultimately, the thing to keep in mind is that we have these different kinds of events, and we can always look up the event itself to see if it's something that we can track via our web applications. All right, so I think finally kind of wrap up here with the overview here. So events are pretty crucial to doing all kinds of different things that we take, I would say, for granted on the web. So any kind of real-time chat messaging, those often use some types of events within the browser. If you've ever used like a stock market tracker, there are different events that might be helpful to consistently update it. For social media interactions, things like click, hover, focus might change your interaction with the site. And for some kind of like auction site, something like eBay, different events might help update the time or show countdown timers, things like that. So there's all kinds of different events that you all have probably seen play out. So in terms of all those different events, we're talking about different interactions that users can have with a website. JavaScript has special names for all of those. We saw some of those on this last page here, right? Submit, click, things like that. In terms of how to handle those events, there's two different ways to do it. The first is onEvent, which is a property, and then we have the addEventListener method. We're going to cover first the onEvent property, and then we'll move on to permissions relying on the addEventListener. So the onEvent property, onEvent properties are built-in properties that enable your code to execute specific logic when an associated event occurs on a JavaScript object or element. For instance, a user clicking on an element triggers a click event. To utilize an onEvent property for this event, we could write something like the following. So this code is a little squished here, but we have a button here, right? So we've named it red button. We're using document.querySelector. So remember, this is making a selection to find the first element that matches the CSS selector passed in as a string. So document.querySelector, big red button. That means we're assuming there's some element on the page that has an ID of big red button. We've selected that, so that's thing one. Second, we've created a function that says when button is pressed, and when the button is pressed, we show some kind of alert, right, that has some text in it. We can then add red button dot on click. This is a property that the button will have, and set it equal to that function. So notice a couple of things here. First of all, notice these are called onEvent properties, but the actual property itself is on something. So it could be on click, on hover, something like that. And then when we set it equal to a function, we're setting equal to the function name. We're not invoking that function, right? So what this is doing is taking that function and storing it inside the button so that when it's clicked, that's when the function is going to invoke. That's when the function is going to run. It's the special syntax that JavaScript has to attach these different events to particular actions that can be taken. All right, so here's an example here. I'm going to ask you all to go ahead and try this. Go ahead and open up a new tab here by clicking on this little arrow button. All right, and then, I mean, you know, it says you better not click me, but of course we gotta click it. So you all try that out. Let me know how it goes. All right, what do y'all think? You got? So if we click on this, so I think David put this together. This is my sense. All right, so it adds this video to the page and starts playing it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code that was written to do that. So first of all, we take a look at our HTML here. Notice how plain our HTML page is, right? We have our header, we have a body, inside here is one H1, and then we pull in the script. So that's it, right? That's all we have in here. Over here, in our script.js, we're doing something similar to the example that we saw. It's just a little bit more complex here. So we first access the header element. So document.getElements In this case, this is get elements by tag name. This is just a different way of accessing elements. So tag name referring to an H1, and it's grabbing the first one here. I think we could just swap this to be the selector, and that'd be just fine. So we're going to grab the representation of this heading from our virtual DOM, right? Hold on to that. And then we're creating some function. I'll talk through what this function does, but just to get the overall process of it, right? We create some kind of function that we want to attach so that when this header is clicked, we're going to run this function. So we have header.onClick equals onHeaderClick. That's the function right here. This is adding that functionality so that now as a user, if I click on this, right, this pops up. The information getting added here, this is creating an element called an iframe. Perhaps y'all talked about this early on. You've definitely probably seen this. You've seen like a YouTube video embedded in a page, or even like a social media post. These are typically run through an iframe. So it's creating an iframe and then setting some different attributes on it before appending it to the body. So that's how that one works. So again, the things that happen here is that we have to access the thing we want to be interactable, right? So in this case, it's the header. Then we're creating our interaction. That's our function. Then we need to tie those two together based on the type of interaction. So in this case, it's onClick. All right, so that is one way to build interactions into our web applications. A second way is addEventListener. This code looks very similar. So this is our sort of demo code we started with. We have a red button. We have our function here. The difference here is that as opposed to setting it to a property, we're calling this method on the element. So in this case, we're calling red button .addEventListener. We're adding an event listener, some event that's going to happen. It's listening for some type of action. This action is a click. So the first argument that gets passed into addEventListener is the action we're expecting to happen. And then the second argument is the function that should get called once that action occurs. So in this case, we're saying when the red button is clicked, we're going to call the function when button is pressed. All right, that is the difference here. It's pretty minor. It's just this one is a method, the other one was a property. All right, here's an example here. We're going to run the code first, and then we'll talk about what this looks like. Again, a very simple HTML page. Any of you are Pokemon fans or old like myself, you'll only remember the first 150 or so. In this case, each time this button is clicked, we're changing the name of some Pokemon that is getting chosen. All right. So let's take a look at how that works. So the first thing is up at the top up here, someone has very diligently printed out all of the different Pokemon. All right, so this is just an array of strings that has, I don't know what, 152 or something elements within there. The rest of this is pretty similar to what we looked at before. We see here, this is sort of the placeholder of where we're going to edit the text. This is called Pokemon to render. This is grabbing the element with an ID of a span. That's going to be this little span tag right here within that H1 of I choose you. Then our button has document.getElementById, pick button, right? That is accessing, that's pulling our button element from the DOM. So we have access to both of those elements now. We have our function. I'll talk about how that works in a second here. And then we say button.addEventListener click. So when this button is clicked, we want to run the pick Pokemon function. Joseph asked a question, why is the function not called with a parenthesis at the end? So I'm guessing you're talking about this function right here, right? The reason being, if we invoke this function, that action will happen as our code runs. but there's nothing to be returned back for the event listener. So addEventListener is a higher order function. It's expecting a function call. And notice that every single time we click this, it's running that function. If I invoke the function inside of here, let's go ahead and just see what happens. You'll notice it took like a little moment. The page loaded, a Pokemon was chosen, right? One of these names was chosen. When I click this now, nothing works. Right, so this is just running it once. When we invoke the function immediately, that means it's going to run as soon as our script is loaded. If we don't invoke it, when we pass it in, that means we're allowing addEventListener to call that function every time we click. So it's the difference between running it immediately and passing it over to addEventListener to be called every single time it is clicked. Just let me know if that helped out. All right, so again, the main sort of like pattern here that we're trying to follow is we select some element. In this case, we're going to call addEventListener. addEventListener accepts 2 arguments. First argument is the type of event, and then the second is the function that we're going to call. One of the nice things as well about addEventListener is if, for example, we wanted to remove that event listener, we have the ability to with a very nicely named function. So we have this removeEventListener, which is going to remove the event listener, the click event listener. So this time, what will happen is I'll be able to, if I brush this page, I can click this once. It'll then run this code. This code goes through, picks a random number, it chooses a random Pokemon, and then sets the text inside of there. And then at the very end, it's going to remove that event listener from our button so that we can't click it anymore. So I'll press the first one, then if I click it multiple times, nothing else happens because we added that event listener and then we removed it as part of the function call. All right, let me pause here. Any questions on these 2 different ways to add events? All right. So now we have 2 different ways. Just talk about how we can compare these. So this advantage of using addEventListener over on event properties is demonstrated by its sibling method, removeEventListener, which allows you to remove an event listener when it's no longer needed. In contrast with on event properties, the event listener cannot be truly removed until the DOM is refreshed. So for example, consider like a memory game, like one where you're kind of flipping cards over left and right. It would be nice too, if you're building that kind of game in a web application, to be able to flip over one of the cards to see if you're going to match with something, and then perhaps remove the flipping mechanism once it's been flipped over, right? So there can be situations where you want to remove the event listener depending on the circumstances. So that's pretty nice from addEventListener that we have this nicely named removeEventListener as well. There's some other benefits to addEventListener as well. With addEventListener, you can actually add multiple event listeners to a single element and give them different function names. So this example here is when the button is clicked, go ahead and open up some kind of modal. A modal is a name for like a pop-up. And go ahead and send some user analytics. So this might be something that developers do on the back end to sort of say, hey, great, every time a user clicks this, we want to have some sort of event fire that shares that a user is clicking that button. This code could get combined to go into a button.onclick equals some larger function. This is pretty nice. This allows us to write smaller functions that just do one thing as opposed to having to combine everything into one place. And then as it says here, although it wasn't much of a contest, these 2 reasons demonstrate why we'll be using addEventListener instead of onEvent properties for the rest of this module. Some say you should never use onEvent properties. In fact, you might encounter a code that looks like this. This is onclick, and then there's some method name in here. I think this gets actually to the question that you asked, Omar, about are there cases where one is better than the other? I would say in general, so for the rest of this module, we'll be using addEventListener. I think that's kind of the canonical way of doing things now. But we will see onclick, onHover, and some other things come back when we are learning React, which is happening soon enough. So there isn't really like a necessarily this one is by and far away better in some sort of efficiency way. It really just kind of depends on the kind of interactions we're going to do. Because we could use either, in this case, we'll rely on addEventListener because it's a little bit more flexible with what we want to do. All right, quick knowledge check, y'all. Which of the following statements is true regarding event listeners in JavaScript? I'll give you all a moment here to read these. Right, got some guesses coming in. Folks are guessing B. Let's take a look. Yeah, correct answer is B. So in this case, for this event listener knowledge check, event listeners in JavaScript enable developers to attach functions to DOM elements to respond to specific events such as clicks, mouse movements, and key presses. This capability allows for the creation of interactive and dynamic web pages. So that is true about event listeners. All right, excellent job, y'all. One more, what is the advantage of using addEventListener over onEvent properties for attaching event listeners? What is the advantage of using addEventListener over onEvent properties for attaching event listeners? All right, a couple of folks responded, yeah, correct answer here is D. So addEventListener allows multiple event listeners to be attached to the same event, while onEvent properties can only have one listener. Yeah, exactly. And so again, these are quite similar. There's plenty of situations where you could just swap out one for the other and it wouldn't make too much of a difference. Because addEventListener has a little more flexibility, we're going to rely on that one. All right, so when we're calling addEventListener as a method on some individual HTML object, right, we pass in two different arguments to it. The first argument is the type of event, and the second is some kind of function, a callback function. That callback function gets access to a parameter called event. And so we're going to see there's some specific information that we can pull out of that event that can be useful for the interactions we are trying to perform. So there's a couple of definitions right here. Let's go ahead and just take a look at the example over here, and we can start to see what is within event. All right, so let me walk through this example here. It can feel like there's a lot of code going on, particularly once we get the output here. But just to walk through it slowly. So we have our HTML page. This has a head. It connects to a style sheet. Our style here just has a couple different styles in here, nothing too exciting. Within the body element, we have two child elements. The first element here is a button with an ID of event button. And then we are importing our script, right? We're pulling that in. So let's take a look at the script.js file. In here, we are getting access to that event button element, and we're adding an event listener to it. The event that's going to trigger it is on click. When we click that, we're going to call this callback function. Now, we have the function right now in line. It looks a little bit different than how we've done it before. This is also using an arrow function. Remember our arrow functions from earlier. I could name this, right? So I could say something like maybe handle click and call it like that. This is the same thing, right? And in one case, we've named the function. And in the other case, oops, excuse me, in the other case, we've just written the function inline. Okay, so no real difference here, just sort of a stylistic one. Speaking of, which one do you all prefer? Do you like the idea of having it inline here? Or do you like the idea better of having it as a named function? What do y'all think? When you're writing code, what do you think you will default to? What do you think looks nicer? Right, Sarah says as a named function. Dragish says inline. Mar says personally, named function. I like it. I like the different ideas. Yeah, what's nice here is there's not actually really a right answer, right? Either of these can be perfectly fine. I'll say, I like having named functions. It feels very nice once we start to have really complicated code. That can be a nice way to structure your code. Something like this, particularly for like a single page like what we have, this feels totally sufficient. And we get to see exactly, everything's kind of in the same place, right? We can see, okay, when we click, we're just going to do this thing. I don't have to search around in my file to figure out what's going on. So both of those work a-okay. All right, in this case, we'll stick with the example they provided here, which was this inline function. All right, so notice this event parameter has been defined in here. Where does this come from, right? Now, so when we normally write a function, we get to write the parameters, and then when we call that function, we're determining the order of how different arguments go into that function, right? We can define sort of how we want things to look. Remember, with higher order functions, with these callback functions, the wrapping function, the function that calls that callback function, it's going to determine what gets passed into it. So like when we had the example of for each, remember with for each, right? We wrote a function in here. We didn't get to necessarily choose the order of arguments that would get passed in here. There's always going to be something like element, index, and collection. We could rename these, right? So instead of element, if we were working with books, we could call it book, right? We can rename them with the order here and the number of arguments that is defined by, in this case, for each. This is the same situation for addEventListener. The function that gets passed in, it's going to pass in to our callback function this event object. We can call that whatever we want. You also may see it commonly written as just E. Sometimes that comes up a lot. But either way, it's the same thing. All right, so keep that in mind. All right, lots of talking just to get to this button click. So when we click on this, we're going to call this function. We have this event object, this thing we're going to talk about. And in this code, what this is doing is it's saying, okay, let's first of all go ahead and grab the body. And then for each key and event, this is going to be an object. We're going to create a div. We're going to basically add some text that shows the key and shows the value of that key. And then we'll append everything to the page. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when we actually click this. A lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff in here. So this is the event object printed out to our page. This is the entire event object. Okay, you can see there's a number of key value pairs within here. Let's try and figure out a few what these might refer to. So for example here, pointer type says mouse. This might be telling us something about the thing that is clicking, the thing that is pointing around the screen versus, perhaps a different type of device might have a different value. We have screen X, screen Y, client X, client Y. These are probably related to the positioning of this button on the page, right, at any given time, something like that. Same with the X, Y here. These are all probably different coordinates that we could use depending on what we're trying to do with our event. We'll see a number of things have this sort of like object something, object HTML button, function here, right? It's kind of hard to inspect these here, but we can tell if this is some kind of HTML element. This is probably returning us some HTML element from the DOM, right? And if it's a function, this is going to be some method that could get called on event. A couple other things we can see here, we have timestamp. This is the timestamp from when the page was loaded to when the event happened. And this is in milliseconds. So, oh gosh, I don't know. It's been a few minutes at least before that button was clicked. A number of other values as well. Some of the most important in here. So target and current target are, in this case, both going to be pointing towards the same thing. They are pointing towards this button here. And we'll see an example of that in just a moment. So what that means is calling event.target or event.currentTarget will return this element, right? It'll get us access to that element. The event type is click. I wonder if we can find that somewhere in here. Here we go. So that'll tell us what type of action was taken, right, to interact, to cause this event to fire. And then as we talked about, here's the timestamp, and it's just talking about when, from the beginning of the page loading to when that action was taken, how long did it take? All right, so in the previous example, target and current target appear to be the same. And it was a little hard to inspect there, but they were in fact the same. This is the HTML element that was pulled out, so it was that event button, right? However, this is not always true. The reason for this is because with our previous example, the target, the element that triggered the event, and the current target, the element handling the event, are the same. But there are some situations where they might be slightly different. So let's take a look at that. So in this example, we have 6 different little lines up here. And when we click on these, we get a different value for target and current target. Based on what you all can see in Codio on my screen, what would you say the difference is between target and current target? Just based on what you know, just take a guess. I'll keep clicking around over here. So what is the difference between these two things? What are some of the differences we see between these two things? I guess just to be hyper clear, the target, the event target is listed out right here, and the event current target is listed out below. Everyone's been sleepy, huh? You all partying? Did you not invite me? What the heck, man? We all been hanging out and you guys had a party and just didn't invite? All right, so what you might notice, right, is as I'm clicking around, the target shows us one of these list items, right? So depending on which list item I click on, it's selecting that specific element. The current target difference here is it looks like it's the entire wrapping container, right? It's the current wrapping container. So let's take a look at why that is. So let's first take a look at our index.html file. So in this HTML file, this is a little bit busier, right? We have a div here which has an ID of event div, and then we have a div below that has event container. And has this as a class. So this event container, this is the part of our page where this content's getting displayed, right? This is seemingly not the clickable part of our page. Up here, though, we're able to click on any one of these LIs and something changes. So if we head over to script, we have, first of all, we're accessing the event div. So let's go ahead and find that once more. So it's document.getElementById event div. So this is adding, we're going to add an event listener to this entire thing. To the div, the wrapping div, which contains an ordered list, which contains 6 different list items. Yeah? So this is where we're adding that event listener. Okay, now within here, within this code, there's a number of different things happening. The first step here is we first get access to, so actually I'll have a little comment here of like access elements. We're going to grab the element by ID that has target span and element by ID that has current target span. So let's find those. So over here, we have two span elements. This one we can see has target span as the ID. This one has current target span, right? So we're just grabbing the spots where we're going to fill in some information. Okay, then this next step we're doing here is a little tricky, but we're basically saying stringify the object on the event. So that is written up here. Does this need to be this complicated? Now that I'm looking at this again, is there any reason for this to be so complicated? I want to, hold on. Sometimes you just see stuff and you have questions about it. Yeah, I think this is fine as is. All right, I'm going to simplify this code for y'all. All right, so we're declaring a new variable called letEventObject. I just unwrapped some of the code that we haven't talked about yet. And we have this function here called stringifyObject, and we pass in the event. Okay, great. What does that function do? It returns an object that has two keys, target and current target, and it accesses from that event the target, the outer HTML, and the current target outer HTML. It's basically getting the HTML structure from the event, from the current target and from the target. And then down here, we're going to fill in the page. And down here, we're just setting the target to be event object.target and the current target span to be the event object.current target. So a lot of code going on here. To basically, when I click on this, I want to access from the event object we're given the target. I'm going to represent that in HTML right around here. And the current target, I'm going to extract and place right below under the current target heading. Okay, so that's what it's doing. When we click it, it's going to fill in those values. So how do we think about this? What's the difference here? Well, the current target is going to be the thing that has the event listener on it, right? And when we look at our code, that's what we've added our event listener to. It is added to the event div, the overall div, the entire thing, right? The entire wrapping thing is the thing that has the event. It's the thing that's handling that event. When we click on one individual element, we also get access to that. So we get access to the target. That target is just that specific LI. You might have seen at some point in here, and I can't really reproduce it here. There's some point where I was able to select not any of the LIs, like the entire thing. I don't know how I did it. It's probably just looking in between something here. Oh, here we go. Right, so if I click sort of on this overall order list, right, the target and the current target are the same. When I select a sub item within there, it's going to go ahead and give me that specific item. Okay, so what's the purpose of this? So there's a couple different reasons you might end up using something like this. In this case, the important difference here is that when we attach an event listener to some kind of element, we can click within that element if it has child elements, and we might be able to distinguish between those different elements. That might be important with something like, hey, I want to add an event listener. Whenever I click on this huge list, right, I want it to do the same thing, but depending on what the exact list item is they click on, I want something just a tiny bit different. Maybe I want to print that to the page. Maybe I want to make some changes to how the page looks, something like that. In general, though, it'll be often the case that your target and current target will be the same. And either way, the target and current target are accessing some DOM element within the page and giving you access to it. And again, the thing that we're looking at here, and just to be really clear here, is that we're accessing the event.target and event.current target. So these are properties on this object that is passed to our callback function that we pass into addEventListener. Let me pause here for a second. Questions on this in terms of what am I talking about? Why is it important? Why am I like this? Whatever questions you have. Any questions here on this content? All right, clear as water, clear as mud, clear as milk, clear as like, okay, just kind of like a foggy window clear. Okay, all right. Oil. All right, fair enough. Let me, where are we going with this? Yeah, I think this is the kind of place just to pause for a second. So just to step back here in terms of like, what are we talking about overall? What we've talked about so far up to around this point is that we can add event listeners, right? So just to try and rescaffold this, restructure sort of this thinking process. Most important thing, we can add event listeners to individual HTML elements. All right, so that's thing one. Those events are going to be things like click, hover, on load, on switching tabs, right? Like we learned there's dozens of different kinds of events that as software developers we can plan for. Our users are going to interact or going to do something, and when the interaction happens, we'll write some code to do something interesting with it, right? So in this case, right now the event listener is happening is when I click, something happens, right? Something's going to show up on the page. That's the event listener that we're working with right now. So I think that's thing one. That's thing one to keep in mind. Thing two is that thing that happens that we're programming to happen, we get access to a little bit of information from the interaction. All right, we get access to a little bit of information. We don't have to use it. It's not a requirement. But go back to some of the early examples over here. Right, in this little example, this is just saying like, hey, when someone clicks the button, go ahead and display an alert. There's no event there. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to know if they clicked a certain button. We're just saying when the button's clicked, go ahead and show this alert. So that's the main interaction we're focused on, right? But if we wanted to know something about the thing that was clicked or any information about that event that just happens, we can do that by accessing the event object. And we see that right here. I know we started to get a little complicated there. But this event object is something that JavaScript is going to give us that has additional information inside of it. We don't have to use it, but we could. In this example, it's printing out all this information we have access to. I would say, in general, I'm trying to think of what I've actually used like for real. I think a few times I've used something about like maybe I guess not the width. I want to say like the X and the Y, like something about positions. Sometimes I've used that. And then I basically just use target. Target being where is it in here? Right here. Out of all of these, there's lots of things you could do, but I would say I've used those three, and almost always I'm using target. That's one of the main things I'm accessing. So we have access to all this information that we could use. One of the most important is going to be the target or the current target. So that's thing two, right? We can attach events with the functions we pass to the event listener to add event listener. We get access to this event object that has information inside of it. Okay, so those are two important things that we've talked about so far. This last little bit is called event bubbling. I would say it's something we can sort of put to the side, sort of like, oh, neat, okay, interesting. Right, I would say this is not necessarily a core concept so much as it is like something to keep in mind. There is a difference between this target and current target. And that difference is just what the event listener is attached to. In this case, the event listener is attached to the overall div, but the target gives us access to the specific thing they clicked on. I don't think there's going to be too many situations where you need to know about this. But there may be situations where you call target on something or call current target on something, and you get something different than what you expected. And the thing is, I hope you can sort of like put a little flag in your brain of, oh, I thought I was supposed to be getting this thing, but I'm getting something else. I wonder if that has to do with this concept. And what you'll do then is come back to this lesson and read up on it and solve the problem then. This is sort of a weird quirk that might happen with JavaScript and events. Okay, so really just two main concepts here, right? We're adding event listeners. When we add that event listener, we have access to the event object. That's the two main things that have happened. And then we have this event bubbling bit. All right, was that recap helpful in terms of shoving away some knowledge? I got a thumbs up from Omar. It's all I'm looking for. I need that thumbs up to stay alive. All right, let's do a quick knowledge check here. The answers here are target or current target. So the element that triggers an event is the blank, whereas the element that is handling the event is the blank. Go ahead and just think about it. Just think about what might be the case here, and then I'll walk through this explanation once more. So again, the element that triggers an event is one thing, whereas the element that is handling the event is another thing. All right, so the element that triggers the event is the target, right? And we saw that when we, over here, when I clicked on one of these LIs, that is the thing that is triggering the event. It's triggering it to fire. The element that is handling the event, the element that the event listener is attached to, is the current target. That's sort of the wrapping container. So another way perhaps think of this as current target is either going to be the same as or above a parent of the target. That is the minor difference here. All right, goodness gracious. All right, so we've talked about so far, we've talked about pretty much just click, right? We've talked about adding an event listener to an individual object, and then we've talked about accessing some of the information within that event object. That's the main structure. Here's the good news. Once you figure out add event listener, it's the same structure. We're just going to be passing in different functions that do different things and different events that do different things. So that is that's the structure we're focused on today. So we talked about click. That is one interaction that can happen, a pretty common one. Another set of common events are what are called pointer events. They're commonly referred to as mouse events because often we're thinking about them as a computer mouse, but it could be something like your finger touching a screen, like on an iPad or something like that. So here are a few of the different event names. There's more than just this, but some of the most common. We have on click, on double click. This looks a little weird, but it's DBL click. On mouse over, mouse leave. So let's take a look at these different types of events and how they work. So we have some code here. I'm actually walk through the code first before we look at the examples. We're accessing this event span. We don't have access to the HTML in this view, but this is the event span right here. It's basically going to change the text inside of this event span. So we're accessing that. And then we have a function here that's called setSpanText. And we're setting it to the event type. So remember earlier this was click. In this case, it's going to set it to the type of event. So all this is doing is saying, hey, when this function gets called, whatever event there is that has, if it has a type, we're going to go ahead and print that. We're going to show that on the screen. And then we've attached different event listeners to all of these different buttons. And we can kind of tell which ones based on the naming convention here. So where it says on click, that's our click me. Where it says on double click, that's our double click me. Right, these are the IDs. The actual event types are right here. So the event type for click is right here. That's click. The event type for double click is right here. That is DBL click. Mouse over, mouse leave. So let's take a look at what these do. So when I click the button that says click me, this is the click type event. Shocking, I know. It's really throwing you off for a loop. So whenever we click, this is the event listener that gets called. All right, or I should say, this is what gets called with the event. The type of it is click. If I click this double click me one, nothing will occur. That's because I need to double click in rapid succession. The interaction of double clicking is a certain type of event that you can gain access to. In this case, we're doing the same thing each time, right? We're just setting the event type. We could do something special if someone clicked versus double clicked. All right, when we mouse over something, we're not clicking at all. I'm just mousing over. So here I double clicked, and then as soon as my little pointer crosses the threshold into the button and it says mouse over, that event is fired. All right, so mouse over is as soon as someone hovers over, as soon as someone's mouse enters that area, that event is triggered. Mouse leave means when I hover over the area, nothing happens. But when the cursor leaves that space, that event is fired. So mouse over is when as soon as it enters the space of the element that has the event listener. Mouse leave is once the cursor leaves the space that has that event listener. So I click, double click, mouse over, and mouse leave. For the more common events that you might see. Any questions on this? So what we're doing now, right, we have our main structure, we have our event listener, right, that's what we talked about, add event listener. Now we're starting to explore some of the different types of events through which we can trigger some kind of interaction. And so we're seeing a few of them here, right? Clicking, double clicking, just mousing over something could trigger an event, or leaving a space could trigger an event. Sure. Yes, Tatiana asked, like, is there a big difference between these two things? A big difference, not necessarily. A difference, though, yeah. So watch my, and I would definitely try this out on your own as well, like on Codio. But right now it says click, right? So watch where my cursor is. And right now, I'm right next to the mouse over me button, right? That is going to get triggered. That event's going to get triggered as soon as we put the mouse over the actual element, right? As soon as that does, we see that the event changes to mouse over. So that's when that event is firing, as soon as the mouse is over the space here, this button. For mouse leave, notice I'm really close, right? And as soon as I enter into the space, you'll notice it still says event click. There's been no change. So entering into the space does not trigger the event. But as soon as my cursor leaves this space, that's when mouse leave is called. So it's a pretty minor difference, right? In terms of, I don't know, general interactions with the page. But you may want certain interactions to occur only when someone is hovering over, or leave things are the same. And as soon as someone leaves that space, a different event would trigger. Yeah, no worries. Some of these it can feel kind of odd, like when would I care about mouse leave, right? You can imagine maybe something where it's like, if you're building maybe some kind of like text editor or something like that, and you have someone who's able to write on the left-hand side of the page, and as soon as their cursor leaves that space, perhaps it fades out slightly or does some sort of stylistic change, right? There's different things you could imagine triggering based on when someone leaves a space. So these are the kind of things where like it's not worth memorizing, I think, all of these so much as remembering, oh yeah, I think there's an action I can take advantage of here, some kind of event type that I can take advantage of, and look that up when you're trying to do that kind of thing. There's dozens of these, and so it's gonna be hard to recall all of them at a moment's notice. All right, we have a couple other here. These are keyboard events. So keyboard events, of which there are a number. This is when someone's typing something with their keyboard. We have different events that can capture that information. So let's take a look at an example here. So here we have an example of key press and key up. Like mouse over, and mouse leave, this can feel very subtle, the difference here. For key press, if I type, oh, first I gotta wake up my keyboard. If I type a letter, right, each time I press the button, even if I haven't released, this is my computer setting I have, it'll add some little bits and bobs for letters, right? It keeps track of what that letter is. That character, I should say. For key up, if I press a button, it doesn't do anything. But as soon as I release the key, that is when there's a change. Right, so it's only when I'm releasing that the key comes up. All right, so two different ways. So one is on key press, one is on key up. This next slide asks you all to think about, like, when would this be useful? But I honestly think it's hard to think about. But I don't know, can you all think of any differences between, like, what does this matter? Who cares about key press versus key up? Can you think of any situations where this might be useful to have one over the other? I'll be honest, when I was reviewing this before teaching, I was like, what are some good examples of when we would really need to have something super different? It can be kind of hard to think of. One thing that I don't see on my computers because of how my settings are, but you all may notice, is if you hold down key press, it'll keep typing whatever that letter is, and it'll track all of those, right? So that's one thing maybe to keep in mind. Nothing to keep in mind, the difference between key press and key up. This just seems like a sort of, I don't know, something a bit odd. When I click backspace here, I can delete. It's keeping track of some of these keys, but I'm able to add spaces and things. It's really focusing on the like textual keys that I'm typing on. If I do the same thing over here and hit backspace, this is actually keeping track of my backspace as well. So it seems like they actually keep track of a few different types of inputs as well. Just a little different. It's me hitting the command key, it's a meta. So it seems like a little bit of a difference here in terms of how they work. These are the kind of things that to me feels like, yes, JavaScript's been around for a while. There's been some cruft that's kind of just continued to accumulate over time. So there's probably some different situations where you want to really be tracking all the different keystrokes versus just what textual keys someone's typing down. I do think, Omar, for passwords as well, you want to be precise on what someone's typing in, which someone sort of leaving a finger down may or may not be intentional. So maybe you want to use key up instead, right, to track for something that, you know, in case they leave their finger there an extra second, it doesn't track that extra letter. There might be some particular situations where one might be better than the other. All right, so we talked about key press and key up. The next, I think this is the last type of event. Y'all, we're almost at the last. That's pretty exciting. This is probably one of the most common types of events we're going to be tracking. And it definitely can feel like one of the more confusing parts as well. So spend a little bit of time here. So for forms, you all built forms with HTML, right? And before, probably when building forms, you're typing stuff in and it's like, neat. Can't do anything with it, but cool, right? In this case, we can actually track when certain things change on forms. And our next lesson is going to be a lot about different kinds of validations we can do with forms and things like that. So there's some specific form events that will occur that we can sometimes track for. So here are a few of them, and we'll see an example on this next page. We have on change. This fires the moment when the value of the element is changed. On blur, which fires the moment the element loses focus. We'll see an example of that. On focus fires the moment the element gets focused. On submit, so that's when the form is submitted. And on reset fires when the reset button of a form is clicked. These are specifically for forms. So look at all this. Look at all this 77 lines of code of some event handler code. All right, there's a lot of duplication here, so no worries. This is looking like a lot. let's go ahead and just click around here a bit and start to try and understand some of the changes based on what it says here. Okay, so first of all, when I click in on the name, you'll notice that it says name input focused. And when I leave it, it says name input blurred. So focused means, you can kind of see here for me, this has a like pink border around it. When the user is focused in, their cursor is within an input, that's going to be focused. All right, that's going to be focused. That means the form is currently focused on that part of the form. When we leave, you can see there's no longer this little pink outline here. That's called blurred. It means we're out of the input. We've moved somewhere else. We clicked outside of it. So as soon as we go in and focus on something, that's focused. When we leave, that's blurred. Different form types have different events that can or cannot trigger more easily than others. So for example, to click on this checkbox, you can see that there's a change happening. We're tracking the change of this checkbox. It's not talking about focused though, right? It's not talking about focused. And so in this case, I would say focus is most clear with toggleable or inputable form fields. Something like an input that can be focused, something like a dropdown that can be focused as well, right? But a checkbox, it's checked or unchecked. That's kind of how it goes. It's the same thing for radio buttons. Okay, when we type in here, there's actually nothing that's occurring. And when we leave, we'll notice it says name input has changed to whatever. On change is a little bit tricky like this. There's on change, there's also on input as well. And so in this case, with all this code, this looks wild, but essentially what we have up here is we're grabbing a few things, we're grabbing some values, and then we're adding event listeners, depending on the type of event that happens. So the onChange function, this is onChange handler. If we go down and take a look at that, this is really getting tracked for our checkboxes and saying input has changed to a different field value. So this gets triggered on blur. The onChange will also get triggered. There's another type of event called input. Change both of these to input here. This is the one that I think kind of makes more sense in terms of every time I type something in here, it's checking for that input. So a few different types of events here that can be useful to keep in mind. What else is useful to talk about here? We'll talk about this in just a second. Yeah, there's a whole lot of code going on here, but I think the thing to keep in mind is we focused in when we are typing. We can use the input type. onChange is another one that'll track changes that are happening overall to the form when we leave the form. We can also track the changes of radio buttons, checkboxes, and our dropdowns as well. So a few different types of values in here that we can track overall. Let me pause here. Do y'all remember forms? Does this kind of code look familiar to you in some way, or is this too long ago and it's all in the trash now? Does this feel nostalgic? Are you like, yes, please, let me get back to HTML. Let me just write a good form with a nice label. Excellent. Thanks so much. Not completely, but most of it is a great amount of remembering. Cool. So whereas before we had to, we could build these forms and not really track too much that was going on with them. We're now learning some abilities that we have to track different kind of interactions that can happen here. Now, let me ask you all, what are some ways do you think we could use some of these event types? So input, blur, focus, what kind of things might we want to do based on some of these event types. What do y'all think? I think that's the last time you were filling out a form. What are some of the interactions you noticed as you were filling out that form? What do you all think? What are some ways we could use these event listeners, these event types? Here's Tatiana says, focus goes to the part you're filling in with mouses, blur for maybe already complete parts, something far away from the mouse. Blur is actually even a little bit simpler than that. It's focus is for once you're in the field, and blur is just as soon as you click out of that, right? So that could be right next to it or further away. It's not even distance based. It's just you're clicked in versus clicked out. Omar says, I mean, for blur, in case the user clicks outside without completing the info, it gets an alert. Yeah, right. So different kinds of validation we can provide based on these different types. We got some time. Let's just do one. Let's just see what we can do with this. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out these event handlers and custom name handler right here. Let's see how we could use this. So we have our name input. Our name input up here grabs the get element by it's document get element by ID name. So it's finding the element that has an ID of name. All right. We can find that by going over here and looking through our form until we find something with an ID of name. So that is our input, right? We can see there's already some validations kind of added on this. We can see some details in here. It's the text input. Okay. So that's our name input. Let's add an event listener. For our event listener, we have two things we need to get passed in. The first is going to be some type of event. Right, we're going to type in some type of event here. And the second is going to be some function where we're going to do something based on that event. So let's first go ahead and actually let's do like on focus. So when we click in, we want something to happen. So before we get into like a real use case, let's just do something where we can check to see if it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say alert, you clicked in on the name field. So again, we have our HTML element. We're calling .addEventListener on it. That's our method. Takes two arguments. First argument is going to be a string. Second argument is a callback function. In that callback function, we're going to write some code that will fire when this event is triggered on this name element. Okay, so let's take a look. So as soon as I clicked in, it said you clicked in on the name field. Okay, so that's working. Uh-oh, it's gonna say it forever now. Let's refresh the page. We can go a bit away from this now. Yeah, okay, great. All right, so we can see that when we focus in, something's going to happen. Maybe we want to do something like we want to add some style to the form to let the user know, great, we know where you're at, something like that. we could go over here. We could say something like, great, maybe we'll find the form input. And I don't know, what do you all think? Make it bigger, change the color, all kinds of stuff we could do. Let's see when we focus in on it. We'll say name input, dot style, dot border. Let's give it a border of 1 pixel solid red. Let's see if that works. Uh-oh. This page is frozen for me. What did I do wrong? Let's refresh here. Oh. Is Codia working for you all? It's just not working though. Is Codia working for you all? Chris says he had the same issues yesterday. Well, that's a bummer. Omar says it is for now. I'm not sure how to fix this. All right, let me try one more thing. We can just move forward if it's not going to work. Just better reset the box. Something for you all, or just something for me. So I'm just going to open up a new one here. Sorry, excuse me 1 sec, folks. All right, let's see if we can get that to work again. No, just nothing, no interaction. Though my code is gone now. Huh, well, darn. All right, let's do this. Let's go into, let's finish out this last little bit. We'll go through the last examples. We'll take our break and I'll see if I can figure out what's going on here so we can return back to this. Apologies for that. I'm not sure what happened with this guy. Cody is just not happy with me. All right, to recenter us, again, we talked about some of the different ways that forms can be used. We have a few different events in here. We use addEventListener, pass in our events, and then need some kind of function that gets called depending on that. There's one thing we did not talk about yet, which I was hoping you'll be able to click on in just a bit, but it seems like we'll have to wait on that. Down here for the submit handler, notice there's this event.preventDefault. Does anyone know what the default behavior is of forms? When you all are creating forms at the beginning of the course, and you made a submit button, you clicked a submit button, do you see anything happen? Did anything change on your page? I know I'm asking now to pull back, reach back into memory from months ago, perhaps, but do you all remember anything changing on your page when you created a form earlier on and weren't able to submit? Yeah, okay, not entirely sure. The default behavior is it actually makes a web request. So it'll actually send, like, it'll try and send you somewhere based on potentially a path you would put into it. By default, we don't actually want to do that. Sometimes, depending on kind of what we're building with your website. So this event.preventDefault, this will prevent the default behavior of whatever would typically happen. This will work as well with like links. If you want to click on a link and not actually go to that link, but instead do something else, we can prevent the default behavior. So we can see that this is a method that gets shipped with the event object. It's a method that gets shipped with the event object. And again, I'll see if I can mess around with this to get this fixed. So we can see an example of it. But normally when we would submit a form, it would try and send us to a different URL potentially, or sort of refresh the page. That's what it ends up looking like. In this case, though, we're going to prevent that default behavior. And so that's what this next little page is about. The prevent default method in JavaScript. Oh no. Now I can't even scroll. Goodness gracious. All right, well, I can explain it here. So the prevent default method in JavaScript is a handy tool when you're working with forms on a website. Essentially, it does exactly what it says. It prevents the default behavior that browsers typically do when you interact with forms, like submitting data and reloading the page. So instead, you can use prevent default to stop these default actions from happening and write your own custom actions. So an example here is when you submit a form, you might want to stop the default behavior of that form and say that first, let me go ahead and check that all the inputs are correct, and then I'll go ahead and do something with it. Or maybe you want to send them to a new part of the page. Say, great, I've stored that before I submit. I want you to fill out something else, right? Based on perhaps a choice they've chosen. So that's that's what prevent default is. We're going to see more of that, I think, particularly once you'll get to React and working with APIs and things like that. But something to keep in mind and in the back of your head for now. All right, so I think let's go ahead and take a break here so I can actually try and fix this, because I do actually need to scroll on Codio, unfortunately. It's kind of a bummer. So let's go ahead and take our 10-minute break. When we come back, we will hopefully get this fixed, and then we can go through a couple last examples here, and then we can jump over to the lab where we are building a to-do list app. All right, so go ahead and take a 10-minute break. I will see you all soon. How's your break? Did you do anything nice? Drink some water. You drinking some tea? Taking care of yourself? Just like full Sudafed and cold and flu therapy.
How are you feeling about the content today's lecture?
Yeah, can we send out a new poll? All right, thanks. If you all can respond to that poll, much appreciated. Of course, as soon as we went to break, I refreshed the page and then Codio is working fine. It's just how things go, right? So we're ready to get back into it, but we'd love to know a little bit more about how you all are feeling right now. A couple more responses, perhaps. All right, well, it sounds to me like folks are feeling okay-ish about what we discussed. So now that my forms and things are working, let's go ahead and do this. I'll share my screen. We'll go through just that submit example real quick. And I think let's just jump over to the exercise. I think that'll solidify a lot of knowledge for you all and a lot of these individual events. We can always come back to and rediscuss, or you all can revisit these if you have questions about them. So let's try and hustle over to that. All right, thanks to all of you who responded, much appreciated. Get ready here. All right, cool. This was the form we were trying to get working before. So interactive, just looking forward. So I think I just want to actually be able to demo here. is this event.preventDefault. So what I've done with the code here is, here's our submit handler. This function will get called when the form is submitted. So remember that we had this event of submit, right? That's when the event submit handler is called, and then some code is run. Okay. So let's go over here. Let's go ahead and enter in some information here. Great. Okay. So when I submit this up here, I know it's probably small on your screens. I'm sorry, I can't really get this bigger, the location bar. If you're able to sort of squint in and look, you'll see it should say something here, codio.io/form events/index.html, and you can try this out on your own as well. If you comment out that event.preventDefault and we hit submit here, it's going to go ahead and it resets the form that's part of the function that is attached to that event listener. Okay. And then you'll actually see up here, it does refresh. And we end up at the same page, but there's some things added to the very end down here. So these are called query parameters. It's a very minor signal, but essentially what's happened is when we submit the page, it's making a new request. And because we haven't given it a specific location, it's just making a request to the same page. So that's what ends up happening by default. If we add this event.preventDefault back in, go ahead and refresh the page here. Get rid of this little bit on the end. Fill in some information here. I get that same interaction, but the form just resets and we don't go anywhere. So right now, that's all we're seeing with event.preventDefault. It feels very, very minor. Again, this becomes more important as we start to move into React. You'll start working with APIs. There's a lot of really interesting things we can do with JavaScript in terms of interacting with other websites. But I just want you all to kind of just remember this and again, kind of put it on the back burner. This will come back up soon enough. So no worries if you're kind of like, this seems kind of weird. We're going to talk more about it in the future. Just want to make sure you are aware of it. So that was the example I wanted to build for you all. All right, let's go ahead and just jump over to the lab. I think this last little bit here about window events is interesting, but I think I'd rather give you all extra time on this because I think this lab will be interesting and probably pretty tricky. And I would love to have a little bit of time to chat through it all with you all. All right, so the thing we're going to do is we're going to be building a to-do list. So we have, I believe, a working version here. So the idea is the user can input some text. When they click add, it's going to add some little item here. This is a task I need to complete. If I check that box, you'll see the text over here gets either crossed out or uncrossed out. Then we have this little X button, and when we click the X button, it removes that task from the page. All right, so that's the goal of what we're trying to do. I will say you all are reaching to-do list level. This is like anytime any developer learns something new, it's like, all right, let me make my to-do list, see how it goes. So this is a good state to be getting to. All right, just like before, there's a number of steps. In this case, it's pretty much going to be following along with the examples here. So I think what I would like to do is, I think I'm going to pass over to you all. We'll give you all a few minutes to walk through. You can try and do these without on your own, but I think you'll basically need to use the step-by-step instructions down here. So let me just give you all a little bit of time to go through. For example, we'll first do steps 1 through 6. Try this out on your own. We'll come back. I'll do the same thing, and then we'll walk through the code so we can talk about exactly what's happening. I think that'll be the best use of our time, as opposed to trying to fumble around and guess what this lab wants us to do. All right. So let me pass over to you all. Take about, I mean, it's mostly going to be copy and pasting things. So we'll give you like 4 or 5 minutes to do that. Once you're done with this first part, please give me a thumbs up in chat. And once a number of you have completed so, I'll do the same thing, and then we'll actually talk through the code at a bit deeper of a level. While you're doing this, I would love for you to as you start to copy over different parts of this, try and walk through on your own, identify what is going on. You might even want to add comments of here's what I think is happening at each line of code here. Okay. Any questions on what's being asked of you? Makes sense? All right, close enough. Cool. All right, we'll give you all 4 or 5 minutes or so. Again, give me a thumbs up if you get to the end of part 1 and feel like, great, I know what's going on. Juan, you're welcome to constantly turn off and turn on the recording, but you don't have to if you don't want to. It might be a bit back and forth. Cool. I think I'm gonna start moving over to just following along with you all. If you're still doing part 1, that is a-okay. We'll get caught up in just a second here. To Omar, to your questions, let me go ahead and get started on this, but no, nothing will get automatically created when you create a list item. So there's no background magic involved. So let's take a look at these steps and see if there's maybe something that's missing in between. All right, so for this first part, we're focusing on creating and managing tasks. So the first thing it asks us to do is go ahead and add this add task function. So I'm going to go ahead and just close out the function here. So we have the entire thing, but this function will be in charge of adding our tasks. Just in general, this is a good pattern to follow. And if we're thinking about, if you sort of step back and think about, okay, well, how do we build this to-do list? Well, the first thing we're going to be tripping for or thinking about is this add button, right? So when I type in here, I want, when I add it, to add that task. So that's the first thing we want to be thinking about. And starting to think of this as like, let me go ahead and write out a function, I think is a nice way to do it. Because something we could call immediately and maybe test out on our own. So it's a nice way to start overall. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new list item element. This is going to happen inside the function. So remember, we talked about this on Tuesday. We're accessing the document object. That's our representation, our DOM, and that comes with different methods. One of those is .createElement. This create element, we're just passing in the name of the element. That's an li. And then we need to assign that to something because right now this li is not on the page. It's been created in memory, right? It's been created in memory. So for now, with our li constant variable, we're going to have access to the li. All right, so the next step here, this is getting to be a little bit tricky here, or it's a little bit like a cheat in some ways. We're going to set the inner HTML of the li element to include the task text, a complete button, and a delete button. So take a look at what this ends up looking like. So what's going on here? We're setting the inner HTML. We're setting the inner HTML. In the past, what have we used to set the content that's within an individual element? Do you happen to remember the property? Yeah, so in the past, we've been using text content, right? Or inner text, perfect. Right, and those set the actual text as text within that element. Inner HTML is taking a look at this element and allowing for HTML to get added in between as strings. So what this is going to do is this is going to create within this li a span tag, a button, and another button. This is pretty neat, but I'll show you also some weird stuff that can happen if we do it like this. It is much faster though, so it's an interesting way to do it. If we did not want to use this method, if we didn't want to use inner HTML, we could do something instead like span equals document.create element span. Let's say complete button equals document.create element button. Let's delete button equals document.create element button. And then for each of these, we could start to talk about some of the text content inside, right? So we could say span text content equals task text const complete button dot text content equals this little check mark and delete button text content equals. In this case, they've just chosen an X. And then we would need to append all of these things, right? So this would be li append. Can you have multiples? I think you can. So we say span complete button, delete button. So this code is what we've seen, right? It's like step by step adding each of these individual things. Using inner HTML allows you to do all of this as a string. So pretty neat in a lot of ways. And these backticks here, right, using a template literal allows you then to pass in text inside of here. Well, based on the comparison here, do y'all have a preference? What do y'all think? What makes more sense to you? What do you like? What do you dislike? Right, Omar says this second option. Joseph says this first one is interesting. I appreciate that. Yeah. We'll see in a moment. This is actually a safer way of doing this. But I will try and get back to that, see if I can demo it in just a bit. Right now, we'll follow along with what our lab here is trying to say. And just follow along with that. All right, so to go back, we're going to create our LI. They're saying the inner HTML, we're adding some elements to the LI. So there'll be a span, a button, and another button. The next thing we need to do is append the LI element to the to-do list element. Now it's given us this code, but we have not actually defined yet to-do list. I guess that was defined up here. I don't think so, yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and fix this up, right? So we're gonna do something like a to-do list. I'm gonna change this to child since that's the one we talked about. To-do list should be somewhere around here, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the index.html and see what that probably refers to. In this case, there's a UL, an unordered list, with an ID of to-do list. So I think this is probably where we want to append this individual item. So I'll say const to-do list equals document dot query selector. So I'm gonna grab the first item here that has an ID of to-do list. Okay, so we're going to access this. And then we're going to go ahead and add this LI. Great. At this step, I think we can actually just test this out. So I'm just going to run the add task function and type in test. Let's go and refresh the page. Anything happened here? Do this. Oh, do you guys see why? Does anyone else happen to see why nothing happened here, why my code didn't work? It's a little bigger. Yeah, all right. So people have a few different ideas here, right? Okay, so here's what I see. I see that I put tab list, not to-do list. Oops. It just happens. Sometimes you're just typing quick and things occur. Let's go ahead and run this again and see if that one fix solves anything. Okay, so in this case, no. So we're running it. There's a question about whether or not we need this pound sign. So I think this does, this should be correct because we have query selector, right? And we are, with query selector, we add a CSS rule or CSS selector, I should say. And that's how we select the specific ID. So like this part's right. I think sorry is right as well, though. We had append child here, and I deleted append as opposed to child. Oops. You know, I'm talking, I'm looking at the camera, I'm typing stuff out. It's a lot going on. So I appreciate you all helping me fix my code here. All right, so now what we can see this code does work. The button doesn't work. Nothing's happening here, but this code in terms of adding some text does indeed work. And notice we have our little buttons here as well. These are, I'm guessing, styled by our style.css that we're thankfully not really having to mess around with right now. Cool. All right, not bad. Just as a reminder, so we had append child here, and I just changed it back to append. Both of these will work in this case. There's some minor differences between them, but both of them will work. So you can use append or append child. Okay, let's see if I can mess with this. So I'm going to try something different here. Actually, let's go ahead and finish. Let's get to work. Let's just finish these steps. All right, so we have our function. It's working now. Now we need to add an event listener to our delete button, and then we're going to add an event listener to the complete button. So this means we're adding these event listeners to the buttons in here. Right now, these buttons don't do anything at all. So let's take a look first at how to add an event listener to our delete button. So here's the code it's suggesting that we add. Okay. Not going on in this line of code. All right. So these are the 2 lines I've added to the code. I'm just going to add some comments up here so we can really clearly see what we're doing. And as a reference point, this is us create the task. Right, this is us, we're creating the li element, and we're adding some content within it. Then we're going to append the task to the page. That's our next step. And we're going to add an event listener to the delete button. All right, so that's the 3rd thing we're doing. Oof, y'all, what's happening here? There's a lot going on in these couple lines of code. So let's go ahead and break this down a little bit. So this li, this variable, is referencing our list item that we've just created, right? So that's the first thing. We're using our li, and then we're calling .querySelector on it. What do you think that's going to do? Why are we doing this? What do y'all think? I don't think we've talked about this part specifically, but it's a good example. And so then I think we can sort of infer what's happening here based on what we already know. So what do y'all think is happening when I call .querySelector, not on document, but on this specific element? What do you think is happening? Right, what do you think is happening if I call querySelector on an element? Okay, so in this case, what that's doing, remember, typically we've called it on document. We said document.querySelector, right? And then we've searched for something in particular. If we call querySelector on an individual element, it's going to search within this element for something that matches this CSS selector. So document.querySelector searches within the entire document for one or more things, depending on which method we're using. Anything that would match that, right? The first thing that would match that. In this case, we're saying within the LI, go ahead and find me the first thing that matches that has a class of delete button. All right, and of course, we just created that up here. We just created it up here. We know there's something up here that has a class of delete button. So this is grabbing this button right here. This first time through, we're adding our first task. This might seem kind of like, well, we could just call it document. But as we're going to see, when we add multiple LIs, we want to make sure we're targeting the specific one that is within this LI. It's a little different. So what we're doing here is we're grabbing our delete button. And so although we can do this all in one line, I'm actually going to break this out. So I'm going to say delete button equals this, and then we can just continue this statement. I think this is a bit nicer because this just makes it a little clearer what it is we're working with. All right, to that delete button that we've just created, we're going to add an event listener. This is event listener, our addEventListener, the method, remember, takes two arguments. First argument is our event type. That's going to be click. And the second thing is going to be the function. In this function, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the LI. So remember, what this does is it removes that element from the page. Let's go ahead and refresh this and see if this works. So what we've done is we've created the task. We've appended the task to the page, and then we've added an event listener. We haven't removed it yet. We've added an event listener so that when we click on the delete button, it should remove from the page. We click that X, and it does indeed get removed. Cool. Let's take a look at the next one. The next one here, add event listener to the complete button. This one works very similarly. We're searching for the complete button within our current LI. We're going to add an event listener so that when we click it, we're going to run this function. This function will find the span tag. That's this, right? We just created it. It's going to find the span tag that's within our LI, go into the class list, and go ahead and toggle the completed class. Remember, toggle, if the class doesn't exist, it'll add it. If it does exist, it'll remove it. Let's refresh this and try this out. So that's why when we click this button and click it again, it's checking and unchecking. So it's adding a class of completed and removing a class of completed each time we click. Right? It's toggling between on or off essentially for that class. This one we could do the same thing. We could say complete button and just break up this code a tiny bit here. There's some more we could do here as well, right? You could define these functions outside of here, give them names, and pass those in. Any of that will work. All right, let me pause here. Any questions on this code that we've written so far? Any questions here? All right, what's the clarity level? Are we still at oil? Are we at some nice spring water? Is it feeling like mud? Is it feeling like something cloudy? What do we think? Yeah, sure. Fair enough. Fair enough. Sorry. All right, so what this code has done is we've created our LI. We've added that LI to the page. We've added an event listener to this delete button, and we've added it in event listener to this complete button. That is where we're at. And right now, we're manually adding this task to the page. We're calling this function immediately. All right, I think for time's sake, let's go ahead and go through this next few steps together. All right, so next it wants us to define some variables for some DOM elements. We can do that. Go ahead and copy this over. Just trying to get the right size of things. All right, so in this case, these lines of code are just accessing, they're just giving us pointers, giving us variables to access some different stuff, right? We're accessing the to-do form, we're accessing the to-do input, we're accessing the overall list, and then we're accessing some spot that has room for an error message. And we can find those things within here. So in the to-do form, right, that's to-do form ID, we have our error message ID, our to-do list. There's something else. What else was there? The input as well. And that's this input, right? So right now we're just accessing some values. So that's step 7. Next thing it asks us to do is add an event listener for our to-do form. So this is when we submit this form, that's pressing this add button. We're going to submit it, and then we're going to do something. Right, so we're getting set up here to do something. First thing we'll do is we'll prevent the default behavior of forms. In general, I'll say in this class, if you're working with a form, you're probably going to be preventing the default behavior of it. So we do that by saying event.preventDefault. We get access to this method via the event object. The event object we get access to because we're passing in this function as a callback function into addEventListener. So we're going to call event.preventDefault. That's going to stop our page from getting submitted and refreshing. Next, we're going to get the value of to-do input. So this is us accessing what is currently inside of our to-do list. So go ahead and grab that. Sorry, that's my dog saying hello to everyone. All right, so this is the to-do input, right? We're accessing that. Wherever the current value is within that, we're going to pull it back. This .trim method is something we can call on strings, which means if there's any space on either side, it'll remove that space. This is just like a nice little formatting method. We're moving forward. Let's go ahead and just log out this task text. Hold this open. So what we're doing right now is our to-do form has an event listener. When we submit, we're going to prevent the default, and then we're going to log out whatever is currently in our to-do list task. So actually refresh this. I don't know if I did that. I hit add. Oh, gosh, there's not enough space here. You can see this question mark does come through. All right, so we are accessing the value that is currently within this input. All right, excellent. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check if the task text is not empty. If it's not, call the addTask function with task text as the argument. Clear the to-do input value and clear any message in error message. So this is the successful use case. So let's go ahead and copy this over, paste this in. Let's talk about these 2 lines in just 1 second here. But what should happen now at this point, at this step 11, if we enter in some text into here, we should be able to see that task show up. So actually, make sure to refresh it if I did that. What's this? About JavaScript. All right, so if I add that, we can see we do indeed get our task. I know it's a lot of code. I know it's probably feeling a little overwhelming, but this is pretty cool. We're getting to the stage where we have our interface be pretty interactive with our user. As a user now, I can add a task to this. Right, and we start to get tasks on the page. This is pretty neat. Now, based on our add task functionality, these already work, right? So we've already completed that functionality. That's pretty nice. So we can complete stuff, we can remove things. Works pretty well. Now, what these two lines are doing, this line right here is saying to do input.value equals blank, a blank string. And so this is, when I click the submit button, as opposed to leaving this text within here, right? It's actually clearing out the text within here. So we're making sure to do that once we've successfully added a task. Cool. This one down here where it says error message.text content equals empty. That means we're going to empty out the error message. We don't have an error message yet, but we'll see that in just 1 second. All right, step 12 here is if task text is empty, set the text content of error message to please enter a task. So let's go ahead and add that line of code. Okay, so what are the options here? So our condition is if task text is empty, there's nothing inside of it. Sorry, if it's not empty, let me start with the affirmative case. If it's not empty, if we have entered a task, we're going to add that task, and then we're going to clear out the input, and we're going to clear out the error message. Otherwise, if the task is empty, we're going to show an error message. So let's take a look at that. So I just click add, you see this little message shows up down here. And to be clear, I know it feels like we're just kind of pulling code over and running it. This is not magic, right? If we want to update this message, we can add whatever we want to this, right? We are custom building this entire thing. We can define exactly what this experience is like for our users. Now, if I do add a task, we'll say add that task, it was added successfully, and the error message was cleared out. All right, and that's happening from this line. So at the end of step 12, you should basically have a functional to-do list here. We're able to add tasks, and we're able to get error messages if we didn't enter anything in, and we can play around with those tasks themselves. Right. Let me pause here. Any questions on this? Any questions on this so far? This has ended up being 43 lines of code, but I think not too bad to make our little to-do list. Any questions on how this is working, or any questions on why we did something in particular? Okay, all right. Let's finish out this last little bit. So one last step here. This is a suggestion. We don't have our form works pretty well now, but this is handling key press events. The idea here is that when we hit the enter key within our input form, we're basically going to do this thing called send. We're going to dispatch a submit event over and require the form to submit. So I'm sure you all have done this where you've worked with the form and you can actually hit submit and hit enter in order to submit the form itself. I'm going to say, I think this is kind of a little bit advanced here. So I'm going to leave this as is. I think what we've just covered right now. Awesome, thanks for meeting there, I appreciate it. I think what we've covered right now from parts 1 to part 2, I think these are pretty good based on my sense of where everyone is at and how far we've covered. I'll tell you all if you want to follow along with the steps here on your own for 13, 14, and 15. That's an additional task we can get to, but I think if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, this is the content to review right now. And so again, just to kind of loop back here in terms of what we've done. We created a function. In this function, we created a list item. We then added that list item to our page. We then add a delete button and a complete button. These buttons have event listeners, which will perform their own actions, such as toggling a class or removing the element completely. Right, this function will get called whenever we hit the submit button. We hit the submit button, it'll get called as long as we have some text within this input box. If there is some text, we'll go ahead and add that task and then clear out the rest of our form. Otherwise, we'll have this error show up. So those are the steps of what's happening. We talk a little bit about this new thing of inner HTML, right? With this, the idea is that you can actually write HTML within here. We don't have to do that. We can build all of the elements one after another. I think one reason why you might not want to do this, let's see if this works. So this is a common security issue. So notice I added a task in here. I wrote it as HTML. So I did something. What else can we do that would be like wild? Let's do like h2 style color red. It's actually not really great. So what this is doing is, if I write in HTML here, because we're just taking the task text and just dropping it right inside of the span, we're actually able to inject HTML into our page. So this is one of the downsides of using inner HTML, is it makes it vulnerable to different kinds of things that might mess with the overall page in kind of a tricky way. Or maybe you like that. I don't know. Maybe that's fun. You can just write some HTML and add to the page. We could copy an entirely new page and put it into here as something like that. So it can definitely be a little bit tricky. Okay. I think that's the last slide. I just had this feeling like that was probably enough for you all. What do you all think? Is that sufficient? Probably. I'm sensing that there's information flowing out of people's eyeballs at this point. We've really filled up your cups. Yeah, we've gone through a lot. Remember when it was like, it's like week 1 of this, we're all hanging out, we're like, oh, variables, const, let, oof. That was a lot, right? Now we got all this stuff going on. All right, so we'll end a few minutes early here. We can give you back a little bit of time. It's a-okay. Here's what I would say. Yeah, for sure. I need to revisit some of it. So in terms of today's lesson, really the 2 most important things, we'll say the 3 most important things here. The first is that we can add events, right? So these events react to how the user interacts with our page. To do that, we're using the method addEventListener. addEventListener, the first argument of that is a type of event. We had a bunch of examples in here. Hopefully you all can remember click. That's one to sort of like hold on to. Submit will be important as well as we move forward. All the rest of them, it's helpful to know that they exist. But if, for example, you don't remember whether it's actually spelling out double click or if it's DBL click, those are things we can always look up. So, take that, if there's a stress around that of like, I have to memorize all these, we can relieve that stress. The thing to remember is there's different event types. Some of the most common are going to be click, key press, yada, yada, but we can always look up those event types, okay? So we add the event listener to a specific HTML element. And then with that type, we're saying this is the interaction that we're waiting for that's going to happen. We're listening for this event to occur. When that event occurs, we're going to fire off a function. And that's where you all define the functions that we're seeing here of addEventListener. We're adding this function to remove something. We're adding this function to toggle a class, right? We can do whatever we want here. We can manipulate the DOM, which is commonly what we're going to do. We could also do things like throw alerts, do a calculation, any kind of JavaScript code we want to write, we can write within that function. Within that function as well, we have access to the event object. I think that's really the third most important thing is we have that function we're passing in that has the event object. And there are a bunch of key value pairs within that event object. The most typical you might work with would be event.target. I would say that's going to be your use case for a lot of situations. The other pretty common one is event.preventDefault, just because as part of web development, we end up working with forms. So that sort of collection of ideas, those would be the most important things. Everything else in here is to support that. So when we were learning about the different types of events, that's really just to help bolster the variety of events that you all can work with. When we're talking about the difference between onEvent and addEventListener, interesting, right? We're really going to stick with addEventListener. That's the thing to really focus on in this lesson. When we're taking a look at all those keys within the event object, it's interesting. There's some cool stuff in there. We're really going to focus on event.preventDefault and event.target. We're talking about event bubbling for a bit. It's interesting. It's good to know. And if we are asking for an event target and not seeing it, we're seeing something different, that might be something to be like, oh, let me try this out. Let me go look up what we learned before to see if that helps, right? So there's some stuff in this lesson that I think is good to know. It's good as a resource. You can think of this as your textbook, right? This is helpful to come back to. The most important thing is really to focus on that, adding an event listener, figuring out the event type you want, and passing that function where you have access to the event. So those are the things I would focus on in terms of solidifying this knowledge here. And then, of course, what you all saw is, over the course of this week, the skill level sort of ramped up there because all of this relies on us knowing how to access individual elements, how to manipulate those elements, how to add styles, how to remove elements from the page, right? And that's what we talked about on Tuesday. And so that as well, those are the kind of things where we want to know that we have access to these types of actions where we can access an HTML element, we can change it in some way. But if some of the methods, the functions, the properties haven't stuck yet, it's just been 2 days. No stress, right? These are things we can absolutely look up. And like a good Google search, as you all are practicing with this and working on it, would be things like, how do I change the style of a DOM element, right? Something like that. That to me would tell me, great, some of the terminology. And then what we need to do is just practice the syntax of, oh, right, I can use .style, or I can do that set attribute thing, right? Or I can toggle a class. There's so many different ways to do the same thing. It's going to be hard to hold them all in your brain. So just trying to remember some of the different activities we can perform based on what we've learned this week. And I think that will get you pretty far. And feel free to continue to look up information. I forget what it was now. I was sharing one of the projects and someone was saying like, did that in like an hour, but it took me 3 or 4 days. I've been doing this for a while. So a lot of these things are in my fingers, so to speak, right? So a lot of this is just practicing. It's just trying this out multiple times, making sure you have the practice put in, because then some of that like, oh, how do I do this? It'll just come back a bit more